So welcome back, guys, to a series of pods that we're going to be doing on South Asian culture and their health specifically as well. And today's podcast is around cardiovascular health more specifically. So Dee, can you kind of talk us through a little bit more, what is cardiovascular disease? What is it, what really happens within that for people, especially within the South Asian culture?
Yeah, so like cardiovascular disease is an umbrella term for a whole bunch of heart diseases, essentially. So things from like stroke to myocardial infarction, or things like atrial fibrillation. Like there's a bunch of cardiovascular diseases, and like essentially one of the biggest things that happens is the development of atherosclerosis, which is the plaque accumulation in the arteries, and it's one of the things where it's a modifiable risk factor. Like we have interventions that we can do early on in life or as early as possible. And if we can have these good health behaviors in place, they're going to decrease our risk of a whole bunch of cardiovascular diseases as we progress through later life.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I mean, we see, a lot of people coming through saying that either their parents have, suffered from some form of cardiovascular health. And I think there is a predisposition, obviously, for South Asians to, obviously believe that they are going to get cardiovascular diseases in their life. But at the same time, just as you quite rightly mentioned, is that it is down to like their lifestyle. And, I guess the question to you here is like, do you believe that, or have you come across any studies that prove that cardiovascular disease is a purely hereditary disease, essentially? Because I think that is a common misconception that we come across quite often.
Yeah, so it's not purely hereditary. There is certain risk factors that, like in the South Asian population, there's a tendency towards like atopic fat deposition or more central fat for a given BMI. Mm-hmm. So there's things like that are genetic risk factors, but they're also modifiable. Mm-hmm. So like on average, whilst there may be a greater risk in the population, there is also interventions that we can do to like completely nullify that genetic risk. And I guess as cringy as it says, like the quote that people always say is like genetics loads the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger. And I think like that's a nice way of thinking about that there. Yeah. So you may have a higher baseline genetic risk. That doesn't mean that you cannot like modify that completely.
Sure. No, that's a really good way of putting it actually as well about, that, what was the quote again? Genetics
loads the gun,
but lifestyle
pulls the trigger.
That's a really good way of putting it. So let's now kind of dive a little bit into the lifestyle part of things, right? Because obviously that's the one thing that we can control. Like I said, we can modify that. And we kind of want to go into a little bit of detail on what are things we can start doing that are preventative measures to obviously mitigate certain things as well. So Parn, to you, want to ask you a little bit as to what are some things that you would suggest to somebody that comes to say, hey, look, I have this and this in my family. I've got, my father has this, or my mother had cardiovascular disease. How would you kind of speak to them through this? And what are things that you would suggest, specifically from a nutrition perspective, I would say?
Yeah, absolutely. Nutrition's a big one because just kind of bouncing off of whether or not it's hereditary, we think about the diet that our parents and grandparents had, and there wasn't necessarily any thought going into your calories, your macros, your sources of fats, for example. And I think it's a big misconception that it is hereditary only, when certain choices can be made and alternatives can be used to be able to just help the lifestyle be improved a little bit more, right? You think about your typical South Asian diet, tends to be cooked with a lot of ghee, tends to be using a lot of butter, a lot of poorer choices of saturated fats, which naturally tends to be the type of fats that we want to move away from. Now, what we try to help clients understand is there are great alternatives of fats to use that can still allow for you to be getting the adequate amounts of fats in your diet, but just from those healthy sources. Now, what we tend to look at here is not only the sources of unsaturated fats, but obviously ensuring that we're not going above and beyond with our quantities as well, because fats are very easy to overeat on. They
Absolutely.
Make food taste better, and I'm sure a lot of people want to really make sure that their food is
Absolutely.
tasty.
You made a really interesting point there. Sorry to cut you off, but the point that where actually within, Indian food, South Asian food in particular, the reason why there is a predominance of oil usage is because that concept of making food taste better. And yes, fats are there to help the food taste better, to help, bloom the flavor, so to say, but we also don't need it in the amount of quantities that are being used in the way that parents or grandparents have cooked in the past. And yeah, from a gram for gram, the calories per fat is quite a lot more, so it's easily overeaten, like you quite rightly said.
Absolutely. And if you've ever seen a container of leftover Indian food in your fridge the next day, and you see that layer of oil, oh gosh, that's awful. It may taste good, but just that thought process often even puts me off sometimes. So I think, as I touched on the quantities of the oils that we're using, and touching on oil, I think it's just the choices that you tend to cook your foods with. Those healthier fats, those unsaturated fats that I would push clients toward are going to be your olive oils, of course, in good quantities. We may say, hey, use 1 cow spray sometimes, but there's nothing wrong with utilizing oil so long as you're being measured about it. Now, I would always argue that pushing clients towards having those healthier unsaturated forms of fat, like your olive oils, like your nuts, you can have an array of nuts, obviously the walnuts, peanuts to an extent, but prefer to kind of go with cashews and almonds because those are a little bit better, are great sources of nuts to use for your healthy unsaturated fats. But again, be conscious of how much you're having. We've all seen the palm-sized portion, which is like, oh yes, I'm only having a few, but how many do you then put away, without even thinking about it? And then on top of the olive oils, the nuts, one thing that I absolutely love, avocado. I think, it's one of those things where, again, quite high calorie dense, so quantities, of course, matter once more, but a great source of healthy fats. And a tip for you, if you love your avocado, sprinkle some Nando salt on that, sprinkle some Tabasco on it. It tastes fantastic.
Oh, that's a really good tip as well. No, absolutely. I think definitely one of the key things that we see quite often is the high usage of fats, which again clogs up the arteries, like you quite rightly mentioned, and will cause that sort of predominance for cardiovascular disease, right?
Yeah. So like one of the things that's really well established is the P to S ratio. So it's the polyunsaturated fat to saturated fat ratio, and essentially there's a causal chain for cardiovascular disease where it is, first of all, we have this intermediate risk factor of LDL cholesterol or ApoB containing lipoproteins more specifically, and it's the modification of the P to S ratio, your polyunsaturated fats to your saturated fats, that reduce or increase your LDL cholesterol or your ApoB containing lipoproteins, and that's what causes the net deposition of cholesterol in the artery wall. So when it comes to fats, it's very, very simple. Just prioritize plant fats. Just prioritize plant fats over animal fats, because we see this with monounsaturated fats, plant-based monounsaturated fats decrease risk, whilst animal-based increase risk. Saturated fat, particularly things like our 20% beef mince and things like that, it's such a big lever to pull if you're consuming them on a regular basis. Get down to the 4%. There's really no reason. Maybe it is helpful for taste, but just opt for that leaner cut. Something else is getting a direct source of an omega-3 in. So particularly a direct source of DHA. So whether you're getting that in through a fatty fish like salmon, mackerel or sardines, or if you don't consume fish, looking for an algae supplement to get it, you need to get that direct source of DHA in. So things like flax seeds do have omega-3s in them, but the conversion pathway there isn't fantastic. So direct source of DHA, modify your saturated fat, ideally getting it below 10% of your total calories. So that looks like 20 grams of saturated fat a day for somebody consuming 2,000 calories. And then getting up your polyunsaturated fats just up as high as you possibly can while staying within a calorie maintenance if you're at a healthy level of body fat.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And obviously we'll link all the studies and any resources that we talk about in this in the comments section, so you guys can kind of reference back to that. But just to kind of simplify it a little bit, obviously, nutrition's a key part, fat consumption's a key part. Let's talk a little bit about the carbohydrate part of things as well, the protein content as well, because I think that's obviously all encompassing when it comes to nutrition specifically. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the protein content that would be, I guess, in a way beneficial, right? Because we all know South Asian diets aren't protein heavy. So can we talk a little bit, and can you give your sort of insights on that as well?
Yeah,
Sejal.
So just rightly, as you said, South Asian diets are not protein heavy, they're more carb heavy. And it was just like I had a conversation with my mum the other day. She's like, oh, I had loads of chickpeas and I really, had loads of protein. I'm like, Mum, there's more carbs than protein in this. So actually you need to pair it up with yogurts and, cottage cheese or whatever other sources that there are. But the main thing for protein is not only just to keep you fuller for longer, so you don't get the drop in the sugar levels or anything, but it's satiety as well. Just making sure that, that's going to be the number one thing that you plate on your food rather than looking at the carbs. Just rewiring our brain, because growing up, we weren't told about protein.
Yeah.
It wasn't in our vocabulary at all. And I think the more that we talk about it to our families, to our kids, to our parents, actually, it will all start changing. Correct. And then that will have such a positive knock-on effect with the cardiovascular diseases. As we said, it's hereditary, it's there. But what can we do to start preventing these things? And it's about making the different kind of choices.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a really good point there about satiety, is that ultimately most people will end up consuming the Indian snacks that are going to be heavily fried, higher on the carbs, will impact your nutrition in a negative way. But if you're fueling yourself well with good levels of protein, ultimately you'll be fuller for longer and stop you from reaching for those snacks that will tip you in the wrong direction, essentially. Let's talk a little bit about, obviously, blood pressure. Now, I know, obviously, you've kind of experienced that yourself as well. Do you want to give your insights to that, your experiences, and kind of something that, what would you kind of say to that, basically?
Yeah, so again, blood pressure is something that's very, very common with a lot of South Asian parents. And there's things that you can do to try and lower your blood pressure or even look to try to eliminate it. Firstly, it's walking. I think walking has so many benefits apart from, just the movement, but walking gives you so much mental clarity, and blood pressure can be caused by stress and obviously a lot of other things like salt and everything, but I think walking will first of all help lower that stress. No one's ever going to say, oh my God, I had a terrible walk. No one's ever going to regret going out for a walk, whether it's on the treadmill or outside, fresh air, things like that. So you've got your movement side of it. Then you've got, again, the nutritional side of it, so that's lowering salt, not having that extra grind of the salt on top of the food that a lot of our parents, we used to see that there was always salt on the table. Yeah. And people would always reach for salt to add to their food without even tasting what their food is like. And then again, other ways of just reducing stress, I'd say, is just pick up a hobby that you like. It could be painting, it could be reading, just doing something for yourself that's not just movement or nutrition wise. It's really just finding what makes you happy as a person, what fulfills you, and then you'll soon start seeing that those levels of blood pressure will start to decrease.
No, that's a really good point. I like the walking. I think it's a very low hanging fruit, right? Most people don't take advantage of that. They always try to go for something that's either a supplement or something that's quite high hanging that isn't going to have the most impact, essentially. What's your kind of thoughts to this walking? I guess the final part of this is obviously going to be training, and maybe we can discuss a little bit more of that.
Yeah, training just needs to be a non-negotiable. Not like we're biased towards resistance training. It doesn't need to be resistance training. It just has to be some form of physical activity that you do on a regular basis. Like that needs to be a non-negotiable. Like if you're worrying about like certain food groups and things like that, like one of the biggest levers to pull, just train. Just train. Find something that you'll do on a regular basis. Something that will get you out of breath. Ideally, something that will like drive you to adapt and become stronger and maintain your muscle mass as well. But just train. Just train. And in terms of blood pressure regulation as well, so like the DASH diet is something that's helpful. Where you essentially, it's like the dietary guidelines that we have already: plenty of whole grains, plenty of fruit and veg, trying to push up your potassium, trying to reduce your sodium. Something that is very, very helpful to do to reduce your sodium is, one, eat more whole foods, but also we've a good bit of, not a good bit, there's a little bit of literature around salt substitution now. So there's, in the UK anyway, we have something called low salt. It's a potassium salt. You can use it, you won't notice the difference in terms of taste. And it's a way of, one, bumping up your potassium, but also as a byproduct of that, reducing your sodium as well.
Yeah. Any final thoughts to sort of the training aspect at all?
Well, I think just generally speaking, training, whether it's resistance training that we are heavily biased to, or even cardiovascular health. We'd love to know your thoughts on whether, you know, it's a form of exercise that needs to be done to be able to target cardiovascular disease. Because I think people hear those two terms, they think to themselves, okay, it's cardiovascular disease, I've just got to do cardio to try to help out. And
Very good point.
you know, is there any truth to it, or is it more of a case of just being active is the more important thing?
Yeah, I think like, because this is interesting, but I think we're beginning to major in the minors there because the majority of people don't exercise in the first place. And if you resistance train properly, you will have a low resting heart rate, you'll be cardiovascularly fit, whilst you might not be specifically able to run fast or whatever. I think the sweet spot is a combination of both. Like something like 3 resistance training sessions a week and 1 form of cardio. If you're getting your heart rate up really, really high during your resistance training, and then you've maybe got some continuous stuff in there as well, lovely.
Yeah, perfect. Well, hopefully this gives you guys some good insights into, you know, cardiovascular health, how you can improve your health, as well as I said, any links or resources, we'll make sure to put it in the comments, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.